The 1930s were a decade of silence before the storm, a time when the world stood at the edge of chaos, unaware that the deadliest conflict in human history was about to ignite. The scars of the First World War were still fresh. Europe was broken, its nations reeling under economic depression, political turmoil, and a deep sense of humiliation and anger. In this atmosphere of despair, dark ambitions began to rise. Germany, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, was a nation searching for revenge. Its economy had collapsed, its people were starving, and its pride was crushed. Amid this despair emerged a man who promised to restore the lost glory: Adolf Hitler. His fiery speeches painted visions of a new, powerful Germany. He spoke of unity, strength, and destiny, captivating millions who yearned for hope. But behind his promises lay a dark ideology, one that would plunge the world into unimaginable horror. Meanwhile, in Italy, Benito Mussolini had already established his fascist regime. He glorified power and discipline, dreaming of a new Roman Empire. In the East, Japan was on a mission of conquest, invading Manchuria in 1931 and later expanding into China. The world watched, shocked, but silent. The League of Nations, formed to preserve peace, stood powerless, its words loud, but its actions weak. As the decade unfolded, secret alliances began to form. Factories that once built cars now built tanks. Airfields expanded. Armies trained in secrecy. The gears of war started turning long before the first shot was fired. Britain and France tried to negotiate peace, clinging to the fragile illusion that diplomacy could stop tyranny. But behind closed doors, the dictators planned otherwise. By 1938, Hitler's ambitions were no longer hidden. The annexation of Austria-Anschluss took place without a single shot. Europe trembled, yet the world remained silent again. Soon after came the Munich Agreement, where Britain and France, desperate to avoid another war, gave Hitler a piece of Czechoslovakia, believing it would satisfy him. But it only fueled his hunger. In secret, Hitler's scientists and military planners worked tirelessly. Hidden research centers tested new weapons, faster tanks, deadlier planes, and advanced communication systems. The German army, the Wehrmacht, transformed into a formidable force. Behind the curtain of propaganda and parades, Germany was preparing for lightning war, blitzkrieg. Across the Atlantic, the United States remained neutral. The horrors of World War had scarred its people. But in the shadows, American intelligence was already observing, warning of the storm brewing. In Europe and Asia, the world was changing. Rapidly, alliances shifting, nations arming, peace crumbling. As 1939 approached, the storm was no longer a rumor. The clouds of war gathered thick and dark. On August 23, 1939, Hitler made his most shocking move: a secret non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. September 1 Street, 1939, the day the world changed forever. As dawn broke, the German war machine roared to life. Tanks crossed the Polish frontier, infantry advanced in perfect coordination, and the sky filled with the terrifying hum of Luftwaffe bombers. The Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, had begun. The German attack was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was fast, coordinated, and devastatingly effective. The Polish army, brave but outmatched, fought valiantly with outdated equipment and limited air support. Within days, entire divisions were encircled. Roads became clogged with refugees, civilians fleeing burning cities, their lives reduced to ashes. From the air, the Stuka dive bombers screamed as they plummeted toward their targets, their sirens designed to strike fear into the hearts of soldiers and civilians alike. Villages were destroyed in seconds, bridges collapsed, and communication lines shattered. This was modern warfare, precise, mechanized, merciless. The world watched in shock. Britain and France, bound by treaty, declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939. Yet, beyond the declarations, there was little action. On the Western Front, soldiers waited in trenches while German forces crushed Poland in the east. Historians would later call this strange period the Phony War, a time when Europe held its breath, waiting for the next blow. Then came another betrayal. Just 16 days after the German invasion, on September 17, The Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east. Bound by the secret clause of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Stalin's Red Army moved in, dividing the country with Hitler. Poland was carved apart, its people caught between two brutal powers. Warsaw, the capital, became a city under siege. For 3 weeks, its citizens endured relentless bombing and shelling. The streets were filled with rubble, smoke, and the cries of the wounded. Yet the Polish spirit refused to break. Soldiers, students, even ordinary civilians fought street by street, house by house. When the city finally fell, it was in ruins, but its courage would inspire resistance movements across Europe. As the smoke settled, the world began to understand the terrifying new face of war. The Blitzkrieg had proven unstoppable. Speed, surprise, and coordination had replaced the slow, grinding battles of World War I. Germany's new tactics shocked military planners everywhere. The myth of invincibility surrounded the Wehrmacht. But in the shadows of victory, the machinery of oppression began its work. The Gestapo moved into occupied territories, rounding up intellectuals, soldiers, and anyone suspected of defiance. Jews were forced into ghettos, walled sections of cities where starvation and disease spread rapidly. These were the first steps toward a horror the world could not yet imagine: the Holocaust. For Hitler, Poland was just the beginning. In secret meetings, he told his generals that this was only the first phase of his plan. The winter of 1939–40 brought an eerie calm to Europe. After the lightning conquest of Poland, the guns fell silent, but only for a moment. Across the Western Front, soldiers huddled in trenches, waiting for a battle everyone knew was coming. The newspapers called it the phony war, yet behind the quiet, Germany was preparing to strike again. This time, at the heart of Western Europe. In May 1940, the silence was shattered. Without warning, Hitler unleashed his armies westward. The Blitzkrieg had returned faster, deadlier, and even more precise. This time, the targets were Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. Tanks thundered through the Ardennes. Forest a route the Allies believed was impassable for heavy armor. But the German generals had studied every weakness, every blind spot. The Allies never saw it coming. Within days, German panzers burst through French defenses like a flood. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, and French lines collapsed under the pressure. Cities fell one by one. Refugees clogged the roads as thousands fled, terrified of the advancing army. The French government was in chaos. Communications broke down. The great French army, once the pride of Europe, was being outmaneuvered at every turn. In a desperate bid to hold the line, the British Expeditionary Force BEF joined the fight, but soon they, too, were trapped. By late May, nearly 400,000 Allied soldiers were surrounded in the small coastal town of Dunkirk. The sea was their only escape, and the German army was closing in fast. Then came one of the most extraordinary moments of the war: the miracle of Dunkirk. Under constant air attacks, the British launched Operation Dynamo. Naval ships, fishing boats, and even small civilian vessels crossed the English Channel, risking everything to rescue the trapped soldiers. The beaches of Dunkirk became a scene of chaos, columns of men wading waist deep in the freezing water as bombs exploded around them. Smoke filled the sky. The roar of aircraft was endless. For 9 tense days, the evacuation continued. Despite the odds, over 330,000 soldiers were rescued. Britain had turned defeat into defiance. As Prime Minister Winston Churchill later declared, "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall never surrender." But for France, there was no miracle. On June 14, 1940, German troops marched into Paris, the City of Lights, went dark under the shadow of the swastika. The once mighty French army had fallen. Hitler stood triumphant, inspecting his conquered capital with pride. Europe now bowed before him, except for one island nation that refused to yield. Summer 1940. Europe had fallen. From the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean Sea, Nazi banners waved over conquered nations. Only one stood defiant: Britain. Isolated, surrounded, and threatened with invasion. The British people braced for their darkest hour. Hitler believed victory was near. If Britain could be forced to surrender, the war would be over. His plan Operation Sea Lion depended on one thing: total control of the skies. Without it, his invasion fleet would be easy prey for the Royal Navy, and so began one of the greatest air battles in history, the Battle of Britain. In July 1940, the German Luftwaffe launched its assault. Thousands of bombers and fighters filled the skies above the English Channel. Their goal: destroy the Royal Air Force (RAF) and break Britain's will to fight. At first, the attacks targeted coastal defenses and airfields. The skies became a deadly dance of fire and smoke, where brave young pilots, some barely 20 years old, faced impossible odds. The RAF fought back fiercely. Outnumbered, they relied on skill, courage, and a new secret weapon radar. It gave Britain the ability to detect incoming attacks before they arrived, allowing the RAF to intercept with precision. The Germans had no idea how their every move was being tracked. Day after day, the battle raged. The Luftwaffe attacked air bases, radar stations, and aircraft factories. Many British cities lay in ruins, yet the RAF refused to yield. Pilots flew multiple missions a day, often returning to the skies with barely enough fuel or ammunition. The losses were devastating, but their spirit remained unbroken. Then, in September 1940, Hitler made a critical mistake. In retaliation for a British raid on Berlin, he ordered the Luftwaffe to shift focus from military targets to cities. The Blitz had begun. London burned for 57 consecutive nights. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, and families took shelter in underground tunnels as bombs rained from the sky. Yet even in those dark nights, the British spirit shone bright. Civilians sang in shelters, firefighters battled the flames, and the RAF continued to defend the skies. One reporter described it perfectly: "Never was so much owed by so many to so few." Those words, spoken by Winston Churchill, immortalized the heroism of the RAF pilots, the few who saved their nation. By October, Hitler realized the impossible. The Luftwaffe had failed. The RAF still controlled the skies, and Britain stood undefeated. Operation Sea Lion was postponed and then quietly abandoned. For the first time, the Nazi war machine had been stopped. June 22, 1941. Dawn broke over Eastern Europe as 3 million German soldiers surged across in one 800-mile front. The operation had a name, whispered only in secret: Operation Barbarossa. It was Hitler's grandest and most dangerous gamble. The invasion of the Soviet Union. The world was stunned. Only 2 years earlier, Germany and the USSR had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, promising not to attack each other. But for Hitler, this alliance had always been temporary. His true goal, revealed in Mein Kampf, was to conquer the East, to seize land, resources, and destroy communism. He believed the Soviet Union would collapse within weeks. As German tanks rolled forward, the initial results seemed to prove him right. The Red Army was caught completely off guard. The Blitzkrieg struck with terrifying speed and precision. Soviet planes were destroyed on the ground, and entire divisions were encircled in massive pockets. Cities like Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev fell in rapid succession. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured, the largest mass surrender in history. But behind the chaos, a much deeper struggle was beginning. Hitler had underestimated his enemy. The Soviet Union was vast, its resources immense, and its people hardened by hardship. For every city taken, more resistance emerged. Soviet commanders, initially overwhelmed, began adapting. The German army, meanwhile, faced growing challenges. Supply lines stretched thin, fuel ran low, and the harsh Russian landscape began to fight back. By September, German forces stood at the gates of Leningrad, in the north, Moscow in the center, and Ukraine in the south. But the lightning war that had crushed Europe now slowed to a brutal grind. Soviet soldiers fought with unmatched determination. In Leningrad, the siege began a nightmare that would last 872 days. Civilians starved, freezing through winters with no heat or food. Yet they refused to surrender. As the weeks turned to months, another enemy emerged: the Russian winter. The German army, unprepared for the freezing temperatures, suffered terribly. Tanks froze solid, rifles jammed, and soldiers wrapped themselves in makeshift clothing. The same icy roads that had once carried them forward now became graveyards of steel. In December 1941, the Soviet counterattack began. Reinforcements from Siberia seasoned. Battle-hardened troops struck back near Moscow. The German advance halted. For the first time, Hitler's army was forced to retreat. What had begun as a triumphant invasion now turned into a war of exhaustion and blood. Operation Barbarossa had failed to achieve its objective. Instead of collapsing, the Soviet Union stood defiant, ready for total war. The Eastern Front would become the largest and most brutal battlefield in human history, where millions would perish in mud, ice, and fire. The attack on Pearl Harbor had set the Pacific ablaze, but it had also ignited something far greater: American vengeance. The shock and grief that swept across the United States transformed into a fierce resolve. Factories thundered with production, shipyards worked day and night, and new fleets rose from the ashes of destruction. A nation once divided by isolation now stood united with a single cry: remember Pearl Harbor. Meanwhile, Japan's empire expanded rapidly. Its forces advanced through the Pacific like a tidal wave, taking the Philippines, Singapore, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies. To many, it seemed unstoppable. Japanese soldiers fought with unwavering discipline and terrifying ferocity. While the Imperial Navy dominated the seas, civilians across Asia suffered under occupation. Prisoners of war endured brutal treatment, forced into labor and starvation. But far from home, in Washington and Pearl Harbor, a plan for revenge was already forming. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his generals Douglas MacArthur and Chester Nimitz understood that defeating Japan would require time, courage, and innovation. The Pacific was vast, dotted with countless islands, each one a potential battlefield. The U.S. would have to fight its way across the ocean, one island at a time. The first sparks of hope came in April 1942, when 16 American B-25 bombers, led by Lt. Colonel James Doolittle, launched from the carrier USS Hornet to strike Tokyo itself. Though the Doolittle raid caused limited physical damage, its psychological impact was enormous. For the first time, Japanese civilians heard air raid sirens over their own capital. The illusion of invincibility was shattered. Japan could be hit. Then came Midway, June 1942, the turning point. The Japanese planned to lure the U.S. Navy into a trap, destroy its carriers, and secure control of the Pacific. But American codebreakers had intercepted Japan's plans. When the Japanese fleet arrived near Midway Atoll, the Americans were ready. The battle raged across the sea and sky. In just a few crucial minutes, American dive bombers struck with devastating precision. 4 of Japan's elite aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were destroyed. The victory was monumental. The Japanese Navy, once dominant, had lost its edge forever. From that moment, the tide began to turn. The U.S. launched its next great campaign, Guadalcanal. For 6 brutal months, soldiers fought in jungles thick with disease, mud, and death. Every inch of land was paid for with blood. The Japanese fought to the last man. Surrender was unthinkable. But by early 1943, the Americans had held the island. The myth of Japanese invincibility was finally broken. The Pacific War had become an inferno, a struggle of endurance, willpower, and unimaginable sacrifice. As the U.S. advanced from island to island, Japan's empire began to shrink. The once rising sun was now burning out, piece by piece. By the summer of 1942, the war in Europe had become a monstrous struggle of endurance. Hitler, furious over his failure to take Moscow, turned his gaze southward. His new objective was the city of Stalingrad, a symbolic prize that bore the name of his greatest enemy, Joseph Stalin. Capturing it, he believed, would crush Soviet morale and secure control of the vital oil fields of the Caucasus. On June 28, 1942, Operation Blue began. The German Sixth Army, led by General Friedrich Paulus, advanced toward the Volga River, Behind them rolled the mighty panzer divisions, supported by the Luftwaffe's unrelenting bombers. From the sky, Stalingrad was reduced to a smoldering wasteland. Entire neighborhoods vanished in clouds of dust and fire. Civilians were trapped inside the inferno, caught between retreating Soviet troops and advancing German forces. But Stalin had made his orders clear: not a step back. Every street, every building, every room would be defended. And so began one of the bloodiest battles in human history. The fight for Stalingrad became a living nightmare. The once grand industrial city turned into a labyrinth of rubble. Soldiers fought hand to hand in the ruins of factories, train stations, and apartment blocks. Snipers hunted each other in the shadows, and machine guns echoed through the shattered streets. The Volga River, meant to be an escape route, became a river of death as boats carrying reinforcements were shelled relentlessly by German aircraft. The Germans, confident at first, soon found themselves trapped in an urban hell. Every corner was a battlefield. Soviet defenders, often with little food or ammunition, refused to yield. The Red Army's tactic was simple but devastating: hold the city at all costs while reinforcements gathered beyond the horizon. As winter set in, the tide began to turn. The Soviet counter-offensive operation, Uranus, launched in November 1942, struck from the north and south, encircling the entire German Sixth Army. Suddenly, the hunters had become the hunted. Cut off from supplies, freezing, and starving, the Germans found themselves trapped in the ruins they had once conquered. Inside the encirclement, despair grew. The Luftwaffe tried to airlift supplies, but it was never enough. Thousands of soldiers froze to death or succumbed to starvation. Still, Hitler refused to allow a retreat. He ordered Paulus to fight to the last man, promising that relief was coming, but it never did. By February 1943, the end was near. On January 31, Paulus surrendered his headquarters. 2 days later, the last resistance in Stalingrad collapsed. Out of the 300,000 German soldiers who entered the city, fewer than 90,000 survived to be taken prisoner. Most would never return home. Stalingrad was more than a victory, it was a turning point. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. From this moment onward, the Soviet Union began pushing westward, reclaiming the lands lost to Hitler's armies. As the snows of Stalingrad buried the German dream of conquest in the east, the winds of change began to blow across the deserts of North Africa. For the first time, the Allies were ready to take the fight directly to Hitler's forces and reclaim the momentum of the war. Since 1940, the vast sands of North Africa had been the stage for a relentless tug-of-war between the British and the Axis powers. The desert was unforgiving: scorching days, freezing nights, and endless dunes where tanks became ghosts. At the center of it all stood two brilliant commanders: Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the German Desert Fox, and General Bernard Montgomery, the determined British leader. Rommel's tactics were daring and unpredictable. His Afrika Korps struck with precision, outmaneuvering larger British forces and capturing territory from Egypt to Tunisia. The desert became his battlefield of genius and his prison of pride. But by late 1942, the tide was turning. The British, supplied by American industry and intelligence, began to push back. The decisive moment came in October 1942. At the Second Battle of El Alamein, the roar of artillery lit up the night as Montgomery's army of tanks and infantry advanced through minefields and enemy fire. For 12 brutal days, the two sides clashed in the blazing desert heat. When the dust settled, Rommel's army was in full retreat. Churchill declared triumphantly, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." But El Alamein was only the beginning. In November 1942, the Allies launched Operation Torch, a massive amphibious invasion of French North Africa. American and British forces landed on the coasts of Morocco and Algeria, marking the United States' first major ground operation of the war in Europe. For many young American soldiers, it was their baptism by fire. The landings were chaotic but successful. The Allies faced resistance from Vichy French forces loyal to Germany, but within days, the situation shifted. Many French units defected and joined the Allied cause. Together, British and American troops began to close the trap around Rommel's retreating army. By early 1943, the Axis position in Africa was collapsing. German and Italian troops, surrounded and out of supplies, made their final stand in Tunisia. The desert that had once carried Rommel's victories now witnessed his downfall. In May 1943, over 250,000 Axis soldiers surrendered, a loss equal to the disaster at Stalingrad. The Desert War was over, as the snows of Stalingrad buried the German dream of conquest in the east. The winds of change began to blow across the deserts of North Africa. For the first time, the Allies were ready to take the fight directly to Hitler's forces and reclaim the momentum of the war. Since 1940, the vast sands of North Africa had been the stage for a relentless tug-of-war between the British and the Axis powers. The desert was unforgiving, scorching days, freezing nights, and endless dunes where tanks became ghosts. At the center of it all stood two brilliant commanders, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the German Desert Fox, and General Bernard Montgomery, the determined British leader. Rommel's tactics were daring and unpredictable. His Afrika Korps struck with precision, outmaneuvering larger British forces and capturing territory from Egypt to Tunisia. The desert became his battlefield of genius and his prison of pride. But by late 1942, the tide was turning. The British, supplied by American industry and intelligence, began to push back. The decisive moment came in October 1942. At the Second Battle of El Alamein, the roar of artillery lit up the night as Montgomery's army of tanks and infantry advanced through minefields and enemy fire. For 12 brutal days, the two sides clashed in the blazing desert heat. When the dust settled, Rommel's army was in full retreat. Churchill declared triumphantly, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." But El Alamein was only the beginning. In November 1942, the Allies launched Operation Torch, a massive amphibious invasion of French North Africa. American and British forces landed on the coasts of Morocco and Algeria, marking the United States' first major ground operation of the war in Europe. For many young American soldiers, it was their baptism by fire. The landings were chaotic, but successful. The Allies faced resistance from Vichy French forces loyal to Germany, but within days, the situation shifted. Many French units defected and joined the Allied cause. Together, British and American troops began to close the trap around Rommel's retreating army. By early 1943, the Axis position in Africa was collapsing. German and Italian troops, surrounded and out of supplies, made their final stand in Tunisia. The desert that had once carried Rommel's victories now witnessed his downfall. In May 1943, over 250,000 Axis soldiers surrendered, a loss equal to the disaster at Stalingrad. The Desert War was over. The victory in North Africa was more than a triumph of strategy, it was a message to the world. The Allies could win. From the deserts of Tunisia, the eyes of the Allied commanders now turned north, toward the vulnerable underbelly of Hitler's Europe. Italy, what began as a land of fascist dreams, would soon become the graveyard of Mussolini's empire. In July 1943, under the blazing Mediterranean sun, the Allies launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. It was the largest amphibious assault ever attempted at the time, involving more than 160,000 troops, thousands of ships, and countless aircraft. British and American forces landed on opposite ends of the island, united by one goal: to drive Italy out of the war. The beaches of Sicily erupted into chaos. Gunfire echoed across the cliffs as Allied soldiers stormed the shores under enemy fire. The Germans fought fiercely, but the Italian troops, weary, disillusioned, and hungry, began to surrender in droves. As Allied tanks rolled inland, the Italian army's faith in Benito Mussolini crumbled. Within weeks, the invasion's shockwaves reached Rome. On July 25, 1943, Mussolini, the self-proclaimed deuce of fascism, was arrested by his own government. The Italian Grand Council voted to remove him, and King Victor Emmanuel III ordered his imprisonment. The man who had once dreamed of reviving the Roman Empire now found himself in chains. But Hitler refused to let his ally fall without a fight. Furious, he ordered German paratroopers to rescue Mussolini in a daring operation known as Operation Oak. On September 12, 1943, commandos led by Otto Skorzeny swooped down on gliders to a remote mountain hotel in the Gran Sasso. In a dramatic few minutes, Mussolini was freed and flown to safety, not to reclaim Italy, but to become a puppet leader of a dying regime. Meanwhile, Italy itself descended into chaos. After Mussolini's fall, the new Italian government secretly negotiated an armistice with the Allies, signed on September 3, 1943, and made public days later. Italian soldiers, caught between loyalty and survival, faced impossible choices. Some joined the Allies. Others were executed by the Germans. The German response was swift and brutal. They seized control of northern and central Italy, disarming Italian units and deporting thousands of civilians. The once beautiful cities of Italy became battlegrounds of resistance and revenge. The war had come to the heart of Europe, and it would be long and bloody. On September 9, the Allies landed at Salerno and began their push toward Rome. The mountainous terrain favored the defenders, and the Germans fought with grim determination. Every village, every hill, became a fortress. The advance was slow, costly, and steeped in mud and blood. The night before June 6, 1944, was heavy with silence and storm. Across the English Channel, thousands of soldiers waited, their faces pale beneath steel helmets, their hearts pounding with the weight of destiny. They knew that by dawn, they would be part of the greatest invasion in history. The operation was called Overlord. The world would remember it as D-Day, the day that turned the tide of the war forever. For years, Hitler's fortress of Europe had stood, unchallenged from the Atlantic to the Russian steppes. But now, under the leadership of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Allies were ready to strike back. Months of planning, deception, and sacrifice had led to this single day. Fake armies, false radio signals, and phantom divisions were created to trick the Germans into believing the invasion would come at Calais, not Normandy. At midnight, the first phase began. Airborne divisions from the United States and Britain dropped behind enemy lines under the cover of darkness. Thousands of paratroopers landed in chaos scattered across the countryside. Some lost, some surrounded, yet they fought with courage, capturing bridges, sabotaging railways, and holding villages until dawn. Then came the sea. As the sun rose over the English Channel, the horizon turned black with ships, more than 5,000 vessels, carrying 156,000 troops toward the beaches of Normandy. The code names of those beaches would soon become sacred in history: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. At 6:30 a.m., the first landing crafts hit the shore. The ocean churned red as waves of soldiers rushed through bullets and barbed wire. Omaha Beach became a nightmare. The Americans faced relentless German machine gun fire from fortified cliffs. Bodies fell into the surf. Men crawled forward through sand and blood. Yet inch by inch, they pushed on. By noon, the beachheads were secure. The cost had been staggering. Over 10,000 casualties on the first day, but the Allies had achieved the impossible. The gates to Western Europe were open. From the beaches, the troops advanced inland through hedgerows and ruined villages. French resistance fighters rose up to aid them, sabotaging German supply lines and ambushing convoys. Within weeks, the Allies captured the vital port of Cherbourg and began their march toward Paris. For Hitler, D-Day was a disaster he had feared, but never believed possible. His generals scrambled to react, but Allied air supremacy and overwhelming numbers crushed every counterattack. The myth of Nazi invincibility was shattered. In London, bells rang. In Paris, hope flickered for the first time in long years. Across the world, people dared to believe liberation was coming, but the victory came at a price that could never be measured in numbers. The beaches of Normandy became sacred ground, where thousands of young men from every corner of the world gave their lives for a single dream: freedom. Winter, 1944. The world believed the end of the war was near. Allied forces had liberated France, crossed into Belgium, and were preparing to strike at Germany's heart. But in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, Adolf Hitler prepared one final, desperate counterattack, a gamble that would become the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought by American soldiers in World War II. The plan was bold and reckless. Hitler believed he could divide the Allied armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies into a peace deal that would allow him to turn all his remaining power against the Soviets in the East. It was a dream born of delusion, but one that would plunge Europe back into chaos. On the morning of December 16, 1944, under a shroud of fog and snow, 250,000 German troops struck without warning. Artillery thundered through the forest as panzer divisions smashed into the thinly held American lines. The surprise was total. Thousands of soldiers were cut off, communications were severed, and confusion reigned. The Germans advanced quickly, creating a deep wedge, a bulge in the Allied front. Towns like Stettevith, Elsenborn Ridge, and Bastogne became names etched in history. Roads were clogged with refugees and retreating vehicles as winter storms grounded Allied aircraft. For a moment, it seemed as if Hitler's gamble might succeed, but amid the chaos stood defiance. In the small Belgian town of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division, young, exhausted, and vastly outnumbered, held firm against relentless German assaults. Surrounded and nearly out of ammunition, they refused to surrender. When a German officer demanded their capitulation, American Commander Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe sent a one-word reply: nuts. That single word became a symbol of Allied resolve. Days later, on December 26, General George S. Patton's Third Army fought through snow and enemy fire to reach Bastogne, breaking the encirclement. With clear skies returning, Allied aircraft roared overhead, pounding German tanks and supply lines. The tide turned once again. By January 1945, the German offensive had collapsed. Hitler's armies had lost more than 100,000 men, thousands of tanks, and precious fuel they could never replace. What had been meant to split the Allies instead broke the back of the German war machine. For the soldiers who endured that bitter winter, the memories never faded. The blizzards, the frozen foxholes, the friends who never came home. The Battle of the Bulge was a victory won not just by strength, but by endurance and courage in the face of impossible odds. As the snow melted and spring approached, the Allied path was clear. Germany was crumbling, and the road to Berlin lay open. But the closer the end came, the darker the truth of Hitler's empire would become. As the Allied armies pushed deeper into Nazi-occupied Europe, victory seemed near. But with every mile gained, the soldiers began to uncover a horror beyond anything they had imagined, a horror that revealed the true face of Hitler's regime. What they found were not just battlefields, but graveyards of humanity. For years, rumors had spread across Europe about concentration camps, prisons where Jews, political prisoners, and other groups were sent to disappear. Many dismissed the stories as exaggerated, but when Allied troops reached the camps, the truth could no longer be denied. In April 1945, American forces entered Buchenwald and Dachau. British troops liberated Bergen-Belsen. The Soviets reached the largest of them all, Auschwitz, in Poland. What they found defied comprehension. Behind barbed wire fences lay mountains of corpses, emaciated survivors, and the ashes of millions. The air stank of death. The soldiers, hardened by years of combat, wept as they saw the living skeletons staggering toward them, whispering, "We are free." The Nazi system of extermination had been vast and systematic. Across occupied Europe, more than 6 million Jews were murdered in a campaign the Nazis called the Final Solution. Alongside them perished millions of others: Roma people, Poles, Soviet Poles, the disabled, and political dissidents. At Auschwitz, trains had arrived daily from every corner of Europe. Families were torn apart on arrival. Men, women, and children separated forever. Those deemed unfit to work were sent to the gas chambers within hours. The smell of burning flesh hung over the camp day and night. The survivors told stories that seemed beyond belief, of starvation, torture, and medical experiments. They spoke of Dr. Joseph Mengele, the angel of death, who performed cruel experiments on prisoners. In the name of science, they spoke of mothers clutching their children as the doors of the gas chambers closed. These testimonies would forever change the world's understanding of evil. The Holocaust was not the madness of a few men. It was the deliberate act of an entire regime, executed with chilling precision and bureaucratic efficiency. When newsreels of the camps reached the public, the world watched in stunned silence. The images were unbearable, yet they had to be seen. The Allies wanted no one, not now or ever, to deny what had been done. At Bergen-Belsen, British soldiers forced German civilians from nearby towns to walk through the camps, to witness the horrors they had ignored. General Dwight Eisenhower ordered photographers to document everything, saying, "Get it all on record, now get the films. Get the witnesses, because somewhere down the track of history, some bastard will get up and say this never happened." The liberation of the camps was not a victory. It was a revelation of how far humanity could fall, and how fragile civilization truly was. The war was nearing its end, but for those who Spring 1945, Europe lay in ruins. From the west, Allied armies advanced across the Rhine. From the east, the Soviet Red Army stormed through Poland and into Germany. Between them stood the last fortress of Nazi power, Berlin, the capital of Hitler's empire. The end had come, but it would be written in blood and fire. By April, Berlin was a city of ghosts, bombed day and night. Its streets were littered with rubble, its skies black with smoke. Hitler refused to surrender. Inside his underground Führerbunker, he ranted about phantom armies and final victories that no longer existed. Around him, the Third Reich was collapsing. The Soviet advance was unstoppable. Over 2 million Red Army soldiers, under the command of Marshal Zhukov, surrounded the city from all sides. German defenses were manned by old men and teenage boys, the remnants of a once mighty army. They fought with desperation, knowing the price of defeat. On April 16, 1945, the final battle began. Soviet artillery unleashed a storm of shells that shook the earth. The city became a living inferno. Street by street, building by building, the Red Army closed in. Civilians hid in basements as tanks rumbled above them, the sound of machine guns echoing through the ruins. In the chaos, the last symbols of Nazi power crumbled. Goebbels broadcast false hope on the radio. Heinrich Himmler tried to negotiate secretly for peace, but Hitler, trapped in his bunker, chose denial. On April 30, 1945, as Soviet troops approached the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler took his own life. Alongside Eva Braun, the dictator who had promised a 1,000-year Reich, ended it with a pistol in the dark. The news spread quickly. His followers either surrendered or fled. 2 days later, on May 2nd, Berlin fell. The red Soviet flag was raised over the Reichstag, captured forever in one of history's most powerful photographs. The swastika, the symbol of terror that had consumed the world, was torn down. For the German people, the cost was unimaginable. Entire cities lay in ashes. Millions were dead or displaced. The dream of conquest had become a nightmare of destruction. In the West, the Allies accepted Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945, a day now remembered as VE Day, victory in Europe. Across the world, people poured into the streets, celebrating the end of 6 years of war. But amid the joy, there was also sorrow for the fallen, for the shattered families, for the world that could never return to what it once was. While Europe celebrated victory, another war still raged. Across the vast Pacific Ocean, the fight against Imperial Japan was far from over, and it was unlike anything the world had ever seen. From the steaming jungles of the Philippines to the deadly coral reefs of the Pacific Islands, the Allies faced an enemy that would rather die than surrender. Since the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, Japan had built a vast empire stretching from Southeast Asia to the Pacific. But by 1944, the tide had turned. The U.S. Navy, rebuilt and stronger than ever, was advancing island by island, a brutal campaign known as island hopping. Each victory brought them closer to Japan, but at a terrible cost. The battles were hell on earth. At Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan, American Marines fought not only the Japanese army, but also heat, disease, and exhaustion. The enemy rarely surrendered. Soldiers fought to the death, and civilians were often forced to do the same. Japanese propaganda taught that capture was a disgrace worse than death. By late 1944, the focus turned to the Philippines. For General Douglas MacArthur, it was personal. He had promised, "I shall return," and return he did. The Battle of Lake Gulf, fought in October 1944, became the largest naval battle in history. The Japanese fleet was shattered, and the path to Japan lay open. But the victory came with a new and terrifying weapon, the kamikaze. Thousands of Japanese pilots turned their planes into flying bombs, crashing them deliberately into Allied ships. Each attack was a suicide mission, a desperate symbol of Japan's refusal to surrender. The sky itself became a battlefield of fire and sacrifice. By early 1945, the Americans reached Iwo Jima, a small volcanic island, only 700 miles from Tokyo. The fighting there was some of the bloodiest of the entire war. For 36 days, U.S. Marines battled entrenched defenders in caves and tunnels. Nearly 7,000 Americans were killed, and almost every Japanese soldier died. The image of Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi became an icon of courage and endurance. Next came Okinawa, the final stepping stone to Japan. It was larger, closer, and deadlier than any battle before it. Over 250,000 people were killed, soldiers and civilians alike. The ferocity convinced Allied leaders that a direct invasion of Japan would cost millions of lives. In Washington, President Harry S. Truman faced a terrible choice. His scientists had created a weapon so powerful it could end the war and change the world forever. The atomic bomb. August 6, 1945. The morning sun rose over the Japanese city of Hiroshima, painting the sky in soft gold. People walked to work, children laughed in the streets, and fishermen cast their nets into the harbor. No one knew that, high above them, a single American bomber, the Enola Gay, was about to change the course of history forever. At 8:15 a.m., the aircraft's bomb bay opened, and a weapon unlike any other fell toward the city below. Its name was Little Boy. 43 seconds later, the world exploded. A blinding flash, brighter than the sun, lit up the sky. A mushroom cloud rose more than 40,000 feet into the air. The heart of Hiroshima vanished in an instant, crushed, vaporized, turned to ash. The temperature at the center of the blast exceeded 4,000 C, and within seconds, more than 70,000 people were dead. Thousands more would die in the days that followed from burns, injuries, and radiation sickness. The city that had been alive just moments before was now silent. A shadow burned into stone. 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, the United States dropped a second bomb, this one called Fat Man, on the city of Nagasaki. The blast leveled entire districts, killing another 40,000 people instantly. Once again, the world watched in horror as fire consumed everything. Japan's leaders were faced with an unbearable truth. Their empire was finished. Their armies were destroyed, their cities in ruins, their people starving. Emperor Hirohito, breaking centuries of tradition, spoke to his nation for the first time on August 15, 1945. His voice, calm and sorrowful, carried across the radio waves. The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb. We must endure the unendurable and suffer what is insufferable. With those words, Japan surrendered. World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, was finally over. Yet victory came at a terrible cost. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the survivors, the Hibakusha, faced a lifetime of pain, radiation, sickness, scars, and grief followed them long after the war ended. Entire families vanished, their memories erased in a single flash. Around the world, the news of the atomic bombings ignited fierce debate. Some saw it as a necessary evil to end the war and save millions of lives. Others saw it as the beginning of a new age of fear, proof that humanity now held the power to destroy itself. The cities would one day rise again, rebuilt from ashes. But the shadows burned into walls, the melted glass, and the haunting silence would remain as eternal reminders of what mankind had unleashed. The world had entered the atomic age, where peace itself would hang in a delicate balance between hope and annihilation. The guns had finally fallen silent. The year was 1945, and the world stood among the ruins of victory. Cities lay in ashes, continents scarred, and millions mourned their dead. The war that had begun with a roar ended in a whisper, the whisper of survivors searching through rubble, of orphans calling for parents who would never return. Across Europe and Asia, humanity faced the monumental task of rebuilding civilization. But this new world was not the same. The balance of power had shifted forever, and the seeds of a new conflict were already being sown in the ashes of the old. In the West, the United States emerged as a global superpower, wealthy, industrially unbroken, and armed with the atomic bomb. Its cities glowed with victory, but behind the celebration lay a new responsibility: to rebuild the world it had helped save. In the East, the Soviet Union stood triumphant yet devastated. 27 million of its people were dead, its cities destroyed, but its Red Army had marched into Berlin and planted its flag on the Reichstag. Joseph Stalin's ambition was now unmasked. He would spread communism across Eastern Europe, forming a wall of iron around his empire. This divide between the capitalist West and the communist East would soon define the Cold War, a silent battle of ideology, espionage, and nuclear threat that would last for nearly half a century. Behind every battle, every explosion, and every victory in World War II, there was a hidden war one fought not with guns or tanks, but with intelligence, deception, and secrecy. This was the war of spies, cryptographers, and double agents, the silent heroes who shaped history from the shadows. In a quiet English countryside estate known as Bletchley Park, a group of mathematicians, linguists, and scientists worked around the clock to crack one of Nazi Germany's greatest weapons, the Enigma code. The Enigma machine used by the German military to send secret messages changed its cipher every single day. Millions of combinations made it seem unbreakable. But in 1940, under the leadership of a brilliant mathematician named Alan Turing, British cryptanalysts built a machine that could think faster than any human, the early ancestor of the computer. By mid-war, the British had cracked Enigma. Every secret message from troop movements to submarine locations flowed straight into Allied hands. Yet the secret had to be guarded carefully. If the Nazis realized Enigma was broken, they would change it. So the Allies often let certain attacks happen, sacrificing lives to protect their secret advantage. The intelligence gathered at Bletchley Park, known as Ultra, shortened the war by years and saved countless lives. It was one of the greatest secrets ever kept. But the British were not alone. Across the Atlantic, the United States launched its own vast intelligence operations. In Washington, D.C., the Office of Strategic Services (OSS), the forerunner of the CIA, coordinated daring missions behind enemy lines. American spies parachuted into occupied France, worked with resistance fighters, and gathered information from Nazi collaborators pretending to be loyal Germans. Meanwhile, in the heart of Nazi Germany itself, a web of double agents played both sides. None were more famous than the British-controlled spy network known as the double-cross system. Agents like Juan Pujol Garque, code-named Garbo, fed false information to the Germans, so convincing that Hitler believed the D-Day invasion would happen in Cologne, not Normandy. This deception helped secure one of the greatest victories of the war. And in the Pacific, another battle of codes raged. The Japanese used a system called JN-25, believed to be impenetrable, but American cryptanalysts led by Joseph Rockefort broke the code just in time to predict Japan's next major attack, Midway. Armed with this knowledge, the U.S. Navy ambushed the Japanese fleet and turned the tide of the war in the Pacific. When the war ended, many of these secrets remained buried for decades. The men and women of intelligence never received medals or fame. Their work was classified, their names unknown. But history would later reveal that while soldiers fought on the front lines, these silent warriors changed the outcome of the war from behind the scenes. War is often remembered through the clash of armies and the roar of battle, but some of the greatest heroes of World War II never wore uniforms. They fought without medals, without orders, and often without hope of survival. Their battlefield was the occupied cities, the forests, and the shadows of Europe. They were the resistance, ordinary men and women who dared to defy tyranny. In France, after the German occupation began in 1940, resistance groups formed in secret. Teachers, farmers, students, and shopkeepers took up arms and sabotage. They cut railway lines, blew up bridges, and passed vital intelligence to the Allies. When the Nazis captured them, torture or execution awaited, yet they never stopped fighting. The French resistance, led by figures like Jean Moulin and inspired by Charles de Gaulle from London, became a symbol of national pride. As D-Day approached in 1944, these resistance fighters launched uprisings across France, crippling German communications and paving the way for the Allied advance into Paris. In Poland, resistance was even more dangerous. The country suffered under both Nazi and Soviet oppression, yet the Home Army, Armia Krajowa, one of the largest underground movements in Europe, organized secret schools, printed newspapers, and smuggled information to the Allies. In 1944, they launched the Warsaw Uprising, a desperate attempt to reclaim their capital. For 63 days, Polish fighters battled tanks and bombers with homemade weapons. The city was eventually crushed, but their courage inspired generations to come. In Denmark, Norway, and the Netherlands, resistance took many forms, from smuggling Jewish families to safety, to producing fake identification papers and sheltering Allied pilots. Even in Germany, small groups like the White Rose movement risked everything to speak out against Hitler's regime. Young students such as Sophie Scholl and her brother Hans distributed anti-Nazi leaflets at the University of Munich until they were caught, tried, and executed. Their final words were simple: "Long live freedom." Across the vast lands of the Soviet Union, another form of resistance burned. The partisans, hidden in forests and mountains, they struck at German supply lines, ambushed convoys, and rescued prisoners. In Yugoslavia, Josip Broz Tito's partisans waged a relentless guerrilla war, one of the most effective resistance movements in the world. And then there were those who fought without weapons: the doctors, nurses, and priests who hid the hunted, the journalists who exposed truth, the children who carried secret messages through enemy checkpoints. Their courage was not measured in victories, but in lives saved and hope kept alive. When the war finally ended, many of these heroes returned to anonymity. Their names were forgotten, their graves unmarked, but their actions, their courage, shaped the very soul of the world that rose from the ashes of war. When the smoke of war finally cleared, the world stood staring at itself, haunted, scarred, and changed forever. The Second World War had taken more than 75 million lives. Cities were turned to dust, nations were divided, and families vanished into history. Yet from this destruction, something remarkable began to rise: the determination of humanity to never let it happen again. In the aftermath of the war, the first great lesson was clear: unchecked hatred and power lead to ruin. The horrors of the Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others, revealed the darkest corners of the human soul. At the Nuremberg trials, Nazi leaders were forced to face justice before the world. For the first time in history, international law declared that crimes against humanity could not go unpunished. It was not just a legal victory, it was a moral one. Humanity had drawn a line in the ashes and said, "Never again." The second great lesson came in the form of cooperation. From the ruins of war, nations formed the United Nations, a fragile hope for peace and diplomacy. It was built on a dream that through dialogue, the world could resolve its conflicts without bloodshed. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights followed soon after, setting a global standard for dignity, freedom, and equality. Yet peace was not easy. The Cold War soon divided the planet against versus West, communism versus capitalism, nuclear fear hanging over every city. The shadow of World War II remained, a constant reminder of what humanity could destroy if it forgot its lessons. The third lesson was technological and moral. The war had unleashed unimaginable innovation: radar, jet engines, penicillin, rocketry, and the atomic bomb. These discoveries proved that science could both save lives and end them. The world now faced a choice: to use knowledge for progress or destruction. And then there were the personal lessons, the ones written in the hearts of those who survived. The soldiers who saw friends fall beside them, the refugees who rebuilt homes from rubble, the children who grew up knowing the price of silence. They carried the weight of memory, a memory that still shapes generations. Today, as time erases the last witnesses, we must ask ourselves, have we truly learned? War still burns in many corners of the world. Hatred still finds its voice, but so does courage. So does compassion. The legacy of World War II is not just in the history books. It lives in the choices we make, in the values we defend, and in the peace we strive to protect. Because the greatest secret of that war was not only how humanity fell into darkness, but how, despite it all, it found the strength to rise again.